Welcome everyone to this webinar focusing on the upcoming ArchivesSpace version 3.0 release and the expanded agent module functionality that is the exclusive focus of this update. I'm Jessica Crouch, the Community Engagement Coordinator for ArchivesSpace, and I'm joined today by Alex Duryee of New York Public Library, Cory Nimer of Brigham Young University, and ArchivesSpace Program Manager Christine DeBella. This webinar will provide background information and context on the necessity of the new agents functionality made available in ArchivesSpace version 3.0. While the required fields to create a valid agent record will remain minimal, the expanded agents functionality will allow for greater compliance with metadata standards used to describe persons, families, and corporate entities like MARCXML Authority and EAC-CPF, facilitate better exchange with databases like LCNAF and SNAC, and support better contextualization of agents by providing more ways to apply controlled access headings or information about agents and their relationships. ArchivesSpace community members Cory Nimer and Alex Duryee will discuss the benefits of the expanded agents module and why an institution may want to implement the new fields and subrecords. After, ArchivesSpace Program Manager Christine DeBella will provide a demo of some of the new agents functionality. A Q&A will follow. As I mentioned, your presenters today are Cory Nimer, Alex Duryee, and Christine DeBella. Cory Nimer is a university archivist at Brigham Young University. Prior to this appointment, he had worked as a manuscripts cataloger, metadata specialist, and technical services archivist. He has served on standard bodies within the Society of American Archivists. In the ArchivesSpace community, he has been part of the Technical Advisory Council and the User Advisory Council. Alex Duryee is the metadata archivist at the New York Public Library, where he manages and develops systems for archival description and discovery. He received his MLIS from Rutgers University. Christine DeBella is the program manager for ArchivesSpace and is involved in all aspects of the program, working closely and collaboratively with the community, advisory groups, and governance board to set and implement the strategy and goals for ArchivesSpace. Christine has worked as an archivist for over 20 years in academic and nonprofit settings, including some where she created records about people, families, and corporate entities in Archivist Toolkit, library catalogs, and word finding aids. We will hold all questions until the Q&A session at the end. Though if you think of a question during the session, feel free to type it into the Q&A panel at any time. We do ask that you type your question into that Q&A option at the bottom of your screen and not into the chat. And with that, I'll welcome Cory, Alex, and Christine. And Cory, if you'll start us off.
All right, thanks, Jessica. Let me pull these slides up. There we go. Thank you again, Jessica, for having me today. It really is a pleasure to participate in this webinar and see the end of this long development cycle for the agent module. Today, I've been asked just to provide a little bit of background about the development of the specification and the functionality that's included in it. And maybe try to provide some information about why this might be useful for different institutions. To start with the background, the current functionality that's available in ArchivesSpace for agents dates back to version 1.0, so September 2013. And for those that are familiar with it, it provides a place for recording different name forms, and some basic contextual information and relationship information. But a few years into our implementation, our local implementation, I know had some questions about additional functionality that was available in EAC-CPF. And we'd noticed some problems with imports and exports. So that was where I started getting involved. In August 2015, I was invited as a member of the Technical Advisory Committee or Council to participate in a small working group with Brad Westbrook and Sue Lefshine to look at what we could do to implement fuller versions of standards for authority records and be able to provide more contextual information in those records. Over a couple of years, we worked to develop a new specification, which was sent out for community review early in 2017. And then we presented on that specification as part of the ArchivesSpace Members Forum in Portland in August 2017. And so since that time, the program has been working on trying to implement those. And again, I'm really excited to be here January 2021 and see a nearly completed draft and an upcoming release of that functionality. As we were trying to put together the specification, though, there were a few things that we were trying to accomplish, and Jessica's mentioned a few of these already. Our primary goal was standards compliance, so being able to support the full implementation of the EAC-CPF standard and to provide a robust implementation of the MARC authorities format in MARCXML. In doing that, we were hoping to be able to improve record sharing or transmission of data between systems. But within the application itself, our hope was to allow users to be able to find information based on qualities of creators that to be able to identify creators that they might not know the name of already. So expanding access to users for materials that were in ArchivesSpace. The final goal was integration with authority services to allow synchronization of data between local implementations of ArchivesSpace and external data sources. And that is, I'll come back to that at the end. That's something that's still under development. Again, in trying to implement those ideas though, we looked at expanding the number of fields that were available for agent records. We looked at the import and export routines and record merging procedures to see if there were areas that those could be improved. And then, unfortunately, maybe as a bit of an afterthought, we looked at the public interface itself, which wasn't as fully developed at the time that we were developing the specification, to see how we might be able to present that information to users. So again, looking at standards compliance, our main goal was EAC-CPF and the MARC authorities format. To be able to try to support both of those, we ended up creating a consolidated data model that included elements from both standards. So as you look at the application today, and I'll show you a screenshot in a minute, you'll see that there are some elements that overlap between those two standards. There are others that don't necessarily, but all of those elements are available in the interface right now to be able to be recorded. Again, for provenance-based searching, we tried to be able to make agents which are sort of a supporting element for resource description currently, to try and center them a bit more, create more linkages between the agent record and subject records so that you'd be able to find agents based on occupational terms or functional terms that were related to them. And from there, be able to find resources that were related to the agent. So looking now at some of those fields, probably the majority of the fields ended up in the control section. So this, in an EAC-CPF vocabulary, the control section is that administrative metadata at the top of the record. But we also, again, included a lot of things that in the MARCXML format would show up in an 008 field or in the leader of the record. So that those can be recorded specifically instead of relying on a generic export, as is currently implemented in the agents module. Again, looking at some of those at the previous screen, you could see being able to record record IDs, various record IDs associated with an agent. And then in this control section, you can also see a lot of information about who's maintaining the record, what language the record's recorded in, and some of the specific things for MARCXML that if you've worked in that standard before, you'll probably recognize, like modification, establishment level. Moving into the identity section, you can see a little bit of this in this screenshot. So we've expanded a lot of the name entry fields. So here, this is a corporate record, a corporate name record, but we've added fields for indicating whether it's a conference or a meeting rather than a corporate entity that's a government agency or a standalone association, which is an important element for MARCXML, accurate MARCXML export. There's also fields for transliteration and language and other elements that have been added here. Moving into the description section, this is probably the largest area for additional information. A lot of these elements, like I mentioned, take advantage of linkages to the subject module in ArchivesSpace. So creating a subject field or a subject record for a birthplace or a death place or residence, adding records for occupations or functions, all of those can be linked. And then on the other, when we look at the public interface, they'll be able to be, you'll be able to transverse that link. So if you're looking for someone with a particular occupation or an organization with a particular functional role, you'll be able to follow that to find associated corporate bodies. Maybe just to mention also, looking at the description section, one thing which I don't have a screenshot of, but will become obvious as you start trying out the application. In order to support the EAC-CPF date model, there were some changes made there. Those are reflected in the interface. They are not the same as what is available in the resource description or other parts of the application. But again, some changes were needed there. And so as you look at that part of the application, you'll see those differences in approach. And then finally, in the relations section, the specification called for the addition of some field, a place field and other contextualizing information for related agents. But it also included the ability to add external resources in a more structured way than the external documents function that was already present in the application. Shown here, you can see the template for entering a linkage to an external resource. In this case, a collection that might be held at another repository, and all the fields that would be necessary to be able to export this as a resource relation in an EAC-CPF record. Switching over to the import and export maps. I don't have any screenshots of the import and export routines, but again, we had a real focus on supporting the full implementation of full EAC-CPF and MARCXML records and their accurate representation and export on the other side. One of the other things, though, that we tried to include was improved functionality for record merging. So here you can see in the current application, if you're familiar with it, again, when you merge records, you essentially choose which record you'd like to remain, and the other records are just deleted. The updated functionality here for record merging allows you to review both of those records side by side and either add or replace elements from those records in the merging process so that you end up with the most complete version that you could get. So rather than having to copy and paste from one record, knowing that it would be deleted when it was merged into another, as part of the merger process, you can select pieces of data to be retained in one record at the end of that merger. On the public side, we've we've worked to try to expose as much of the data as we can that seemed useful to users at this point. So that additional date or the revised date information, as well as linkages like occupation, place, language, those are all exposed as part of the interface. A lot of the control information right now is not made available. And I think that's a discussion that needs to be had in the community moving forward. But right now, they've put a lot of work into exposing the information that we felt that users would need to use to be able to access materials more effectively. On the search side, again, because we've linked to subject records, users will be able to facet on those linked subjects. So here, for example, if you had a database of creators and your repository collected the work of photographers, any of those that had a linked photographers subject, from the subject module, you'd be able to click on a list of subjects and facet down to a limited list of those that included that linkage. So it's a lot of new functionality, a lot of new options for being able to record information about archival creators. Looking forward, for those that have looked at the development version, you'll know that there's still a little bit of work going on. That's, as I understand it, expected to be wrapped up soon, but Christine will be able to provide a more complete discussion of the status. Looking at the specification, though, specifically, there are still 2 areas of the specification for those that might be reviewing that have not been implemented, and we'll look forward to that in the future. Those were, again, greater specificity in recording agent relationships. There's still a couple of fields that haven't been implemented there. And then that goal of external authority file synchronization. So being able to set your repository to link to SNAC or the Library of Congress authorities and be able to take advantage of updates that are coming from those systems to update local versions of those records in an ArchivesSpace instance. So with all of those changes, we hope that institutions will consider using as much of that functionality as makes sense to them. In doing the work, again, our hope was to provide improved data portability. So being able to import records from other services like SNAC and being able to export and contribute that data to other projects or move that information from one system to another. We're also hoping that by making those fields available, institutions will consider what might be useful for their users in finding material, whether that's added function linkages or occupations or whatever the fields that they choose to implement, that they'll be thinking about their patrons and their staff and how this functionality might be able to better support them in their research. And then finally, again, our hope was to be able to support institutional workflows. And Christine will talk a little bit about this, I think, too. We've thrown a lot of fields out in the specification, and a lot have been implemented. But I think it's worth noting that maybe not all individuals in your workflow will need to be able to use all of those fields at any particular time. And so in addition to sort of throwing out this full view of all these data elements, the project staff have implemented a light view, and that Christine will be demonstrating that might allow, if you have a workflow that's involving multiple steps and multiple groups, some individuals may have access to only a portion of those records, while others might be allowed to view and edit the full complement of fields that are available in the application. So I'll hand this off to Alex at this point. Again, if anyone's interested in looking at the original specification, it's available in JIRA at this link here in the middle, ANW 429. And then Christine will be doing a demonstration, but there is a development version showing current work on the application to implement this functionality. And that's available at the link there at the bottom. So anyway, thank you. And we'll take questions at the end, but I'll hand this off to Alex right now.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alex Duryee, the metadata archivist at the New York Public Library. And today I'll be talking about how the new Agents module can be used to support SNAC implementation within ArchivesSpace. And along with Iris Lee at the American Museum of Natural History, I'm also the co-chair of SNAC's Technology and Infrastructure Working Group, which provides consultation, feedback, and specifications for policy and data refinement. So what exactly is SNAC? SNAC is a cooperatively maintained resource for the description of corporate bodies, persons, and families interrelated to one another and to the historical resources that provide evidence of their lives and work. As a cooperatively maintained resource, SNAC serves interrelated functions that benefit both curators and research users of cultural heritage resources. And in other words, SNAC turns the traditional archival relationship between collections and entities inside out, where repositories often have collections with their related entities, but SNAC instead focuses on entities and their related collections. And since SNAC is an entities first resource, its primary data model was designed around EAC-CPF instead of, say, EAD. SNAC's administrative home is the University of Virginia and is additionally maintained by the SNAC Cooperative, which consists of member organizations around the globe. So that all being said, so what? Why would I want to participate in SNAC? So one of the major advantages of using SNAC is that as an archival resource, it includes many entities that may not appear in other authorities. As such, SNAC identifiers can be used to identify and disambiguate names, even when they may not have entries in resources such as the LCNAF. And in addition, by implementing SNAC into your metadata processes, you can attach your collections to entities in SNAC. And this will improve discovery of both your collections, as researchers that use SNAC can now find that your repository holds relevant material to entities that they may have otherwise overlooked, and also to those in other repositories, as researchers will be able to go from your finding aids to SNAC and from there to other relevant collections. So that being said, what were the previous barriers to using SNAC with ArchivesSpace? And the main problem was that it was very, very difficult to use multiple authorities for a single agent record in ArchivesSpace. The data model didn't support the assignment of multiple identifiers to agents, which meant that you weren't able to assign a SNAC ID to an agent if there was already existing authority identifiers. So in other words, if I wanted to go through and assign SNAC IDs to agents, it came at the cost of taking away identifiers for other authorities, such as the LCNAF or VOF. And in addition, SNAC wasn't listed as a source in ArchivesSpace, which meant that repositories that did implement SNAC would have had to add a non-standard source to their instance, which will lead to data, which will lead to non-standard data between different repositories. The old agents module also did not fully support EAC-CPF, which meant that managing records that were imported from SNAC via its EAC-CPF export wasn't really viable, since there would be a lot of data lost going either from EAC into ASpace or from ASpace into EAC. And that all being said, the agents module redesign was an opportunity to revisit how ArchivesSpace could be used to better support SNAC implementation. So during the summer of 2020, the SNAC TIWG reviewed the agents module that was in development. And we had 4 major questions in mind, which were, how could the module be used for EAC-CPF maintenance? How could the module be used for SNAC integration? What would the SNAC cooperative like to see from the module before release? And what would the SNAC cooperative like to see from the module over time? The TIWG submitted its report to the ArchivesSpace team in September and is pleased to announce that the agents module either already met its expectations or that the ArchivesSpace team implemented the features the working group requested. And I'd like to walk through each of these questions and what it means for you. And I'd also like to take a moment and thank both the working group and the ArchivesSpace team for reviewing the agents module and implementing the feedback in the report. So our first sort of guiding question was, how could the module be used for EAC-CPF maintenance? And one major feature of the new agents module that Cory discussed is that the data model is now much more comprehensively supports EAC-CPF. In terms of managing EAC-CPF metadata, the agents model is very complete. The working group was very, very pleased with testing it out and testing out the module in terms of metadata functionality for EAC. And this is a real tremendous improvement over the old module, where instead of sort of creating the sort of stub EAC-CPF records based on the old agents data model, which you would then have to send over to external tools to more thoroughly describe, you can now manage complete records within ArchivesSpace itself. And in addition, record creation, editing, and imports and exports are quote-unquote SNAC ready in terms of metadata support, in that fields can be mapped between ArchivesSpace and SNAC with very little data loss. And this wasn't really possible before. So from the SNAC perspective, it's very exciting that data can be sent to and from ArchivesSpace without losing data. And more to that point, imports and exports are much more complete. I never want to say always when it comes to metadata, but the working group was very, very happy with how complete the EAC-CPF imports and exports to and from ASpace were. So that being said, the second question is, how could the module be used for SNAC integration? And by far, the most important new feature from SNAC's perspective is that multiple authority identifiers can now be added to agent records. So if a record, say, already has a LCNAF identifier, you can now add in a SNAC ID and also keep the LCNAF ID present. And this allows for any agent to be associated with SNAC, even if the agent was already authorized elsewhere against, say, LC or VOF. And also, as you can see, SNAC is now sort of, the SNAC authority is now sort of baked into ASpace, where when you start using it, you'll see that there's already a SNAC source as SNAC identifier type. So now when moving data around, you can, the data is much more standard for moving data between systems. And in addition, this opens up the possibility of using data that's imported from SNAC to populate even more authority IDs. SNAC does include in its records IDs such as Wikidata. So if a SNAC record is imported into ASpace, it'll carry with it all these identifiers that can now be stored within ASpace and used perhaps for things such as linked data reconciliation. So given these really exciting changes, what were the things that the SNAC Cooperative recommended? The working group did find that, as Cory mentioned, and as Christine is going to show, that the data model itself is very comprehensive. And coming from sort of both the EAC-CPF editorial perspective and sort of the linked data management perspective, we found that that different users had a lot of different metadata needs. So we're very excited to see that that light mode allows for users just to focus on the elements they need to focus on without actually removing support or removing data that may already exist for a record. So if, for example, I just want to create a lightweight record and slot in, say, the LCNAF and SNAC ID, and later on, say, pull in data from SNAC or from an EAC-CPF record to more comprehensively populate it, I can do that quickly via the via light mode. And the working group also requested that that via the PUI records for agents, that the if there's a SNAC ID present in the agent's record, that the SNAC URL appear in the PUI. And we're very excited to announce that this has been implemented. So if there is a SNAC ID for an agent, that will be exposed to the public. And this is very exciting from a research and reference perspective, since researchers can now see from an agent's PUI screen that there is this SNAC record they can follow to find more resources related to that individual. And this way they can see that, oh, there are, other related material, there's other related individuals that they may not have known about just working with a single finding aid. And of course, the question is, well, given all that, what comes next? What would the cooperative like to see for the module in the future? So now that the sort of foundational and metadata modeling work has been done within ASpace, the SNAC team plans on adding support for importing metadata from SNAC into ArchivesSpace automatically. Now that there's both the data modeling support and the multiple authority IDs. So as an example, if you add in a SNAC ID to an agent record and import the record and then update it from SNAC, you could pull in, say, the biographical history, alternative forms of the name, other authority identifiers such as LC and Wikidata, and have that all be automatically populated. So you could do things such as, by adding more identifiers, improve it for linked data purposes, and also improve the agent record in the PUI to enhance the research experience without requiring a lot of copying and pasting or data entry on the part of any archivists. There is also discussion around exporting data from ArchivesSpace into SNAC, which will most likely focus on exporting archival resources from ASpace to SNAC and connecting them to existing SNAC entities. And this will allow for collections to quickly be made available within SNAC itself, which will enhance both the discovery in SNAC, and also in general improve the greater archival linked data ecosystem. And in addition to those sort of future wishes, now that the new module is about to be released, the working group really looks forward to hearing about how people are using it and what they'll like to see, both from the module side and from the SNAC side. Both ArchivesSpace and SNAC are cooperative, community-driven efforts. So feedback today could turn into tomorrow's new feature. And speaking as both an ArchivesSpace user and a SNAC user, I'm very excited to see sort of what's going to come next from the integration of these two very exciting tools. If you have any questions, either for me or for the working group, there's my email, and please feel free to contact me with any comments, thoughts, recommendations, etc. Thank you, and I'll hand it over to Christine.
All right, I'm just going to get my screen shared with you all. Okay, so as you can probably tell from the previous presentations, this was quite an undertaking. It was an overtaking too, but because it took a lot of time, a lot of energy, but it was quite a large undertaking. This was really the first time we overhauled a major record type in ArchivesSpace since the original release. So there are a lot of moving parts that go into, really re-envisioning what a record type should look like, and different kinds of stakeholders to consult, different community members that really, in this case, took the lead on thinking all these issues through, and then different ways that needed to be expressed in a specification, expressed in ways that developers could translate that into code, different ways that testers could test that. So I want to thank everyone who's been involved along the way. It's been, quite a large cast of folks, and continuing to be, lots of people continuing to be involved. I am not going to give a demo today, actually, because this is continuing to be quite a moving target based on the testing that we've gotten. We've gotten so much really great feedback, but that means that what it looks like right now, the screenshots that Cory has given really give you a good sense of what it's going to look like, but some of the specifics of how it works and what's on it in specific areas are still a moving target. So rather than sort of nailing that down in this webinar and showing you something that might be out of date by tomorrow, I'd rather just talk through a few larger issues. But all that said, we are definitely going to need testers, more testing once the release candidate comes out. So please respond to that call. If it seems like there's a lot of people interested, thanks to all of you for attending today. So please, we'd love you to test this once it comes out in a release candidate. As you would imagine, as I'm sure some of you have experienced, it's always better that we catch a bug before the actual full production release comes out, rather than trying to run and catch up to it after it's out and lots of people are using it. So that's my plug for testing. Alex explained light mode a little bit, and this is another one where I'm not actually gonna demonstrate it yet because it's not quite exactly how it's going to be. But as Alex said, we understand, and as Cory said, we understand that people are going to be using this in different ways. So we don't want to, in this case, we didn't want to, and the feedback was from users, that it would be really helpful to not kind of mandate that everybody not just be, having to use all the fields that are there, but also having to sort of navigate everything that's there in these complex records now, if they didn't need to. So the underlying data schema is going to be the same for agents. Once you make the upgrade to this, everybody will have access to the same possibilities for what will be going into agent records. But the view that a particular user has will be different depending on what kinds of permissions a user has and what choices have been made for either a particular record at a particular point in time, or for a particular session that you're working in ArchivesSpace at a particular time. Even once you upgrade, you'll still have the possibility that if you only want some of your users to work with these new fields, or if you only want to work with them on some records, you will have that choice. So that will still be in your hands, even once you make the upgrade. And even like as you're thinking through, everything that you've been hearing in this webinar, thinking through how you might implement this eventually, you'll have a lot of choice for that. So as you've heard from Cory, as you've heard from Alex, we expect that once this has been released and people are working with this for real, people are going to be requesting changes. Some of the areas that, we're already sort of see as things that people are definitely going to want, there may be different or additional choices for imports or exports, whether those are specific items within an import or an export, or specific different ways that the data is put together for a different authority database or a different purpose. We could also see, we've made some choices on the light mode based on kind of what we knew already, but we could see that maybe there may be some reasons to have some different or additional choices for the views. One of the things that the SNAC group specifically mentioned was, would it maybe be something that could be valuable to have a specific SNAC view or a specific EAC versus MARC authority view? Those are some things that potentially, we expect might come from users using this. And then lastly, and this is probably not the last thing, but certainly in terms of what we're anticipating, we anticipate that people may have interest in refining the linking of an agent to a resource or an accession, different kinds of material descriptive records, or reusing data between what is in the agent record already and what's in the resource. So those are some things that currently haven't been addressed, but maybe things that we would expect could come out of people using this. And then Cory also mentioned some things that were in the original specification related to, actually like tighter actual integration with other systems or additional types of relationships. We would be hoping if some of with the actual integration with other systems, as with any of our integrations, we would hope that we could partner with those other people working with those other systems or developers that are working with those other systems to have those kinds of things happening. I think SNAC specifically has in the past, expressed an interest in, putting a developer on that kind of work. And then as always, of course, though, I will say, so this webinar is all about agents and all about the work that's coming out related to agents. But as always, any additional work on this would have to be balanced with the many other kinds of things that people have requested to improve ArchivesSpace in many different ways. So, we always we want to support what community members want. But there are many different types of things that community members want. Sometimes it's different parts of the community, and sometimes it's different community members themselves. So all these kinds of things have to be balanced. But we're very glad that this is something that we have been able to work with so many community members to make that happen. The last thing that I'll say before we get into some question time is that I'm sure everybody's wondering, everybody's asking, what is the actual timing for this release? We are currently, as I said, it's a moving target in terms of changing some of the things based on testing. So we're working on those, sort of fast and furiously. But I would say we're probably not looking, just based on information from the last few days, we're probably not looking at a release candidate coming out this month. I think we're probably more likely to be looking at that release candidate coming out in February, and then hopefully within a few weeks after the release candidate comes out, again, hopefully with lots of testing on you all's part, then we're looking at the full production release where people could start using 3.0 and this new agents functionality in their own production releases at their institutions later in February after that. But I'm happy to, as I have information and can feel confident in, a tighter timeline or a narrower timeline than that, I'll be providing that to the community. So that's all I have to share for now. And then I'll turn it back to Jessica.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Cory. Thank you, Alex. That was great. This was all really useful information, and we already are getting lots of questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and dive into those. I know we only have 10 minutes. We may run over a few minutes, but we'll try to answer, get through all of these questions. If a question is directed to one individual, that's indicated, but otherwise, when I read a question, Alex, Cory, Christine, feel free to dive in if you know the answer. All right, so the first question is from Jackie. She asks, will the authority ID provide RDF URI upon export?
So Jackie, I'd like to know a little bit more about sort of how you would see that working, where that information would be pulled from.
And Jackie, if you want to comment on your answer or comment on the question you asked to provide some context. I've moved it over into the answer column. You should be able to do that, or if you want to contribute in the chat, we'll go ahead and just move on through the Q&A. All right, so James asks, in the description section, what sort of content is the external documents area intended for? And before you answer that, I'll go ahead and say, go ahead and give a shout out to the user documentation sub-team of the User Advisory Council. They have been working to update all of the documentation related to this agents refactoring. So, and I say that because I know that this was something that we worked on clarifying in the documentation. So once this release comes out, please make sure you reference the user documentation and the user manual if you are an ArchivesSpace member. But yeah, so in the description section, what is the external documents area intended for?
And maybe just to say
Yeah.
from the specification side, that external document section was an existing component of the record, which allows you to link out to other records outside ArchivesSpace. We decided to, in doing the specification, we decided to just leave that subrecord the way that it was, but in the relations section, add that separate subrecord for an EAC-CPF compliant version of that to be able to link out to, and primarily to be able to link out to external resources related to a creator you might not have a description of in your local ArchivesSpace instance.
And external documents is common across, almost all the different record types in ArchivesSpace, and people use it a variety of ways. But its use is not limited to the kind of information that Cory's describing. So I think a lot of people maybe use it for, to link out to an internal control file or to link out to maybe a web page that describes something but isn't specifically a collection held by another institution. So this new part of the agent's record allows you to get that greater specificity rather than use the more generic area of an ArchivesSpace record.
Thanks. Katie asks, can you merge an organization in a person, or is it just person to person, organization to organization?
You can only merge like agents to like agents.
Thanks. Vivian Lee asks, Cory, what were the 3 future developments you mentioned? I missed the 3rd one. Thanks.
So I think Christine mentioned all of these. The 3 of the slides were just finalizing the public user interface display of agent records. And then there were some additional fields that added some specification to agent relations. So right now it only includes the sort of EAC-CPF main categories of relationships. And it's a description field and a date. The EAC-CPF specification also included the ability to associate a place with a relationship. And then looking at MARCXML, there was also, so it allows more specific relationship designators than what's available in EAC-CPF. So those 2, place and specific designation, were the 2 fields to be added there. The 3rd one was just the synchronization service. And again, Christine's talked about all of these as far as future development.
Thanks. And then Valerie asks, Cory, again, could you speak more about the example you gave showing all photographers? Is that facilitated by linking the photographer subject to the agent records themselves or to the resources linked to those agents?
So in testing out its current functionality, that was just, that particular screenshot was by going to the browse view for names and then using the facets there on the right-hand side, which again, like Christine said, some of these things are in flux. I don't know if that's one of them, but that was how I was able to create that screenshot using that functionality. And so in that case, all of those were agent records that had an associated occupation of photographers. And so going into that name view, you could just select photographers and it would narrow your list with that fasting down to just those records with that associated subject.
Thanks. All right, Elizabeth asks, does the PUI only display the SNAC identifier and agent records, or will it display all of the identifiers?
For the PUI itself, right now it's only SNAC identifiers. And one reason for that is we had a very specific use case for displaying the SNAC identifiers, but knew that there could be all kinds of different things in the identifiers area. So if there's a different use case where it would be helpful to have the identifier appear in the public interface record, it'd be great if you sent that information to me or put it in a JIRA.
Thanks. All right. Next question. Does the SNAC record link in the PUI automatically open in a new tab? Thinking that if it doesn't, users could get lost navigating away from ArchivesSpace and following SNAC links.
I don't know off the top of my head, but that might be a quiz for Alex since he most recently clicked it.
Yeah. So I just tested it out and it does not open in a new tab. Although that's certainly something that could be added to a, added to a ticket before the release candidate.
Yeah, that would be very easy change to make.
Thanks. And thanks, Sarah. Greg asked, in addition to SNAC IDs being exposed in the PUI, will other authority IDs be exposed too?
You and Elizabeth teamed up on
Yes.
this. So same thing, I would say, like, if you want to sort of put together, if both of you want to work together on that, or in general, if you want to put a ticket in related to what identifiers you would want to display there and how, we could consider that.
That's a great idea. Seth asks, will there be a document highlighting the data model changes for the REST API?
We have, I'm trying to even remember, API has certainly been on the radar. I don't think anything related to documentation for the API has been on the radar for quite a while, but that's something for further discussion. There's a lot of work going on around documentation for the API. This specific thing related to this new model, we may need some help with that.
All right. Seth, I hope you're still here and heard that. So we're going to go ahead, and we're right up against time. We have 3 more questions, and Jackie's chimed in with some input from her question. We're going to get through those. If you have additional questions, please, feel free to reach out. The recording for this webinar will be made available in the coming days on our website. And before I dive into these final questions, Christine, if you want to, some people are asking, they would like to test the candidate and provide feedback. What do they need to be on the lookout for? What should they do? So
when a release candidate comes out, I don't know if everyone makes it down to the bottom of those messages, but I always mention, we'd like testing, where the testing is, and where the test information is. But in this case, this is such a large undertaking. I would love it if people would email me, and I can put my email in the chat, but people probably have it. Email me specifically so I put you on a notification list about testing. We also have in our resources for this webinar, and it's right here on the screen actually, what the test server URL is. So if you just kind of want to informally poke around now, you can do that anytime. But if you want to be notified about like doing a little bit more formal testing when it's ready, please send me an email and I'll compile a list, and I really appreciate it.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. All right, let's get back into the Q&A. So Faith asks, will dates related to an agent that are entered in the dates of existence subrecord be visible or display as part of name headings in the staff user interface? In order for this qualifying information to display correctly, we're planning to add date info to the name form date field as well, thus having to duplicate data entry.
So this is a thing, this had been like in some existing JIRAs and some various other ways. So we are putting function right now, like if you go to the test server right now, you'll see that there's well, I was going to say embarrassment of riches, but it's still like, you don't want it the way it is right now. Right now it's pulling all the dates from everywhere and putting it everywhere, which you don't want, understandably. But there are going to be some conditional things where if you don't have the dates field in a name form filled out, but you do have dates of existence, that can be appended in different ways to different things. So there will be a little bit more display of dates of existence onto the display name in ways that there aren't now, but it'll be conditional only if you would only have one or the other, not both.
Thanks. All right, so Jackie, who originally asked, will the authority ID provide RDF URI upon export? She has followed up with, for instance, identifier for an entity Twain Mark is identifier. Will the data for identifier be in RDF URI, and she provided that link, or URL and provided that link?
It will be what it is in ArchivesSpace, I guess is all I can say. It won't be transformed into a URL if it's not a URL. You can put anything you want in there, of course.
Maybe just to comment again on, say, the specification side too. I mean, one of I know at our institution, we include that URI as our identifier. But in terms of MARC exports or even MARC imports, having a URI in that value just doesn't work. One of the areas that wasn't shown in the screenshots, though, was the alternative set field. So it's a place that you'd be able to include links out to other versions of the entity's authority record and other systems. So being able to record a Wikidata link or a VOF link or even this RDF link from LC, that would be a possibility there too.
Good, thanks. Right, Lev asks, how would the linked occupations functionality of the agents module be different than linked subject headings not linked to agents? We've been entering relevant occupations, et cetera, as subject headings.
So in terms of description, looking at resource records, if you have a linked subject, as I remember the definition from the MARC authorities or the MARC bibliographic documentation, it's meant to be an index term to say that the materials described reflect that that activity or that occupation. Looking at this agent's change or the authorities documentation, it's just meant to say that this agent participates or this is a characteristic of this agent. So they serve slightly different purposes. If you were doing a full browse, though, I would assume that it would bring back whatever was related to a subject, whether that was a resource record with a linked occupation or an agent with a linked occupation.
Yeah, and that actually, I'm trying to remember if you looked at the test server right now, if it would be reflected there. But yes, that is the intention, that if a subject is linked, whether it's linked to stuff or it's linked to an agent, that you would be able to see all of that from the page for a subject.
Thanks. Right. Betts asks, for identifiers, what is recommended for data entry? Should they be just the identifier number? For example, for LOC identifiers, just the N number or the URL that includes that identifier?
I think, Cory, you said some things about sort of your local practice.
Yeah, in some way, it is a tricky question. I mean, again, our local practice was to insert that, and mostly because of not the agents, but the resources that by having that URI included in that identifier field, when you exported a resource record that had that linkage, then that identifier could be exported as part of the person name or corp name entry in the EAD. Looking at with the changes though, and one of the problems again is this data portability issue, that if you're importing a Library of Congress record, it's not going to pull in that URI at the way that the import routine was put together in the specification. It just looks at what is the 010 field, and whatever that value is what gets put in there. And then looking on the export, if you're exporting MARCXML, it's going to put it back in the same sort of place. So I don't know what that means for us locally. I think that definitely is a question that needs to be figured out, and maybe there can be some discussion community-wide as to what the best practice is there.
Yeah, thanks. And then Cory, still on the topic, kind of. Earlier you mentioned that the URI doesn't work in an identifier field. Do you mean that it's not a live link? That is, it's not just a live link in the PUI.
It wasn't so much about the PUI, it was just about the metadata standards themselves. That at least, I know there's an upcoming revision for EAC-CPF, but at least in the current release, EAC-CPF says that an identifier field is a name token, and so having a URI in there is not standard for EAC-CPF. And again, in the MARCXML format, or the MARC authorities format, the O&O field is not anticipating a URI as a value there.
Thanks. All right. Okay, so we did it. We made it all the way through the Q&A. Thank you to everyone who has stayed with us past the hour. I really appreciate it. This was being recorded, so the recording will be made available in the coming days, like I said. To refer to later, and be on the lookout for announcements about both the release and the release candidate, especially if you're interested in testing, which would be greatly appreciated. I'd also like to thank our presenters today, Cory Nimer, Alex Duryee, and Christine DeBella. I appreciate all of the work that you did and are doing to make this this agent's remodeling possible. And I appreciate you presenting today and sticking it out past the hour. So I look forward to seeing all of you at the next ArchivesSpace webinar. Thanks, everyone.